Hello dear bit junkies, it's time for another episode of Stationeers News. It's 2025 September the 15th and today's episode is almost exclusively about programming, about device addressing, cable networks, that kind of stuff. But before we get to that, first some small things that everybody can relate to. Let's start with the Atmos Tablet cartridge. There's something new about it. It no longer exists. Instead, its functionality has been joined into the tracker cartridge that you have from the start. So in addition to the lander now being a permanent beacon that doesn't need any battery that's visible on the tracking cartridge, the new feature that the tracking cartridge even shows your exact world location and has basically always been in your Jetpack when you start makes navigation exceedingly easy now, so that's very beginner friendly. I guess opinions may be slightly torn about this one. I, for example, never used the GPS because my goal with immersion is to forget that I'm just in a game, but now it just tells you its coordinates. I know, real GPS isn't so very much different from this because we're kind of turning reality into virtual space. You think you wouldn't join the crowd of people who use augmented reality glasses? You will though, it will become normal. We even have something like an augmented reality view in Stationeers. The sensor lenses allow to either see through the walls of your station with the T-ray scanner, or you can see what you could harvest from the ground with the ore scanner module, and you can see the location and names of moons and planets and the sun with the celestial scanner. Anyway, the point is, imitating the virtualization of reality implicitly lessens the realness of the game reality. But it's what it is now. Here you can see the resources required to making the tracker cartridge, and here's the resources for the deep miner cartridge. They are the same, and I have no idea if this is kind of a copy-paste effect for the devs to get the show on the road, or if it'll stay like this. There's something wrong with Stationeers lighting, and before you get excited here, it hasn't changed. It's still the same as before. Look at this, brightest day, yet you need a flashlight to look into the locker right in front of you. Now, implementing global illumination where light reflects off of surfaces is computationally intensive. Supposedly there are 1 or 2 global illumination mods for Stationeers, but they're quite taxing, and personally I'm not looking for mods at all. I want the base game to be brilliant, and currently, in regards to lighting, it really isn't. So I was delighted today to see a new mod that a community member came up with. Niku's ambient light fix, still fresh in development, adds some ambient light by just increasing the minimum for nights and increasing the minimum further for days, apparently without considering which world we're on. I'm not saying this is the particular fix that we need, but imagine we had an ambient light minimum slider in the game. Would you not all crank it up a bit to not suffer these stupid black lockers during the day? So this particular fix is very simple, and Niku says that this doesn't have a performance hit. And now look at this difference. This is Stationeers' usual 2 dark shadows. This is with some ambient light boost. Feels much more pleasant, more real basically. Here, while mining, no crass dark shadows, but some realistic feeling reflected light, implemented by just adding some ambient light. Ambient light isn't actually cast light, it's just a rendering minimum brightness setting, depending on angle and color and such. So it's computationally very simple, and it feels so much better. And I hold that this is a Minecraft moment. Remember when Minecraft had this box-like lighting, where every square had its own separate brightness? Then a mod came out that smoothed this out beautifully, and eventually the developers caved and put it in. And since then, Minecraft has had this beautiful lighting. And I'm saying all this here because I would like to nudge the developers of Stationeers a bit to consider that the light and shadow solution currently is one of the major pain points of the experience. Has been for a long time, and shouldn't this change at some point? I mean, the game keeps developing, evolving, but this whole time we are seeing it through this lens of frankly ugly rendering. So this means that our mental Stationeers compass, or what the game is or should feel like, is skewed this whole time, and we probably don't even realize anymore how much we're suffering this. So how good is our judgment really of what the game is and shall be if we are this blinded and distorted? It is time really to lift Stationeers out of this dark shadow, is my opinion. Now let's move on. There's some vending machine news. So we have the refrigerated one and the normal one, and now we also have this tiny one. So the blessing of putting stuff in and pushing a button so that stuff comes out is no longer reserved for those who spare more than an entire world block because these machines are so bulky. No, now we have an ice crusher sized vending machine. Makes me think, how many ice crusher sized machines do we have? This could become a series, because the structural shape is pretty neat. Finally, we got some good news on the tutorials front. Not only have the buttons been fixed to no longer show this white area, which made them feel kinda broken, but there's no longer just the first 3 that you have been knowing for a year now. No, we actually got 3 new ones. About airlocks, that was overdue, about furnacing, and about the 3D printers. And these new tutorials are actually community made. BigfootMSR made these. Not the first time that he contributes some useful stuff to a game. He worked on these for quite a bit, and now they're in standard Stationeers, once the terrain update finally drops. So what do we have by now? Inventory and interactions. Learn the basics of interactions, inventory management and construction. Number 2. Connections. Learn the basics of survival and how to build gas and power networks. Number 3. Atmospherics. Learn how to refill canisters and move gas around the world. And now, number 4. Airlocks. Learn the basics of creating an airlock. Very important for new players and was sorely missing. Now we have it. Number 5. Furnace basics. Learn the basics of smelting. Number 6. Manufacturing. Learn the basics of manufacturing and what printers are available. So I think we all agree it's great that we have these now. The work to get these done was 100% Bigfoot's, and also to get the devs to listen, hey, let's put this thing in there, and they agreed. But I can't resist pointing out that I was the one who figured out how to put working Stationpedia links into the tutorial texts. If you look at the landing capsule in comparison to your equipment lander, there's a jarring difference of visual style, right? The capsule looks space-worn, even on worlds without atmosphere. And the equipment lander has some kind of Lego style going on. Colorful, playful, toyish. Now, to our surprise, the devs just changed this. The lander no longer exists. Instead, we have the Lander Mark II, which is, like Mark I has been for a few weeks, a beacon that conveniently shows up on your tracker, with no power supply or anything. Now this thing looks a bit more real, serious. The equipment is still a bit like Lego, and I wonder what the plan is here. Will that also slowly be changed over time? I don't know. I have no clue. Anyway, the classic lander carries 7 crates and 2 tanks. And of course you remember that some of our start conditions these days come with extra tanks that are standing around in the landscape. Bit problematic on Vulcan, with lava cracks and all. So the old lander, 7 crates, 2 tanks. The new lander takes 7 crates and 4 tanks. So all your Vulcan stuff is now self-contained in this one equipment lander. Boy, the terrain update will be a literal game changer when it eventually finally comes out. So while we're taking in yet further improvements of Vulcan, let's talk about this. Of course we all want this thing to come out. Even I as a beta player am looking forward to it because I know it's very important for Stationeers and for the studio. On the other hand, I still see some things that have only been implemented 80% of the way, like the hydroponics device's maturity ratio and seating ratio, or the missing stack size value of the cable networks. I will talk about those later in this video. So what's the newest information that we have? On the 3rd of September, Matty said,
"Man, it's so close, lol. We're getting to the very bottom of the list of stuff to do."
And well, the last update was on the 17th of March. You can see that here on screen. Stationeers big changes coming, which is now almost half a year ago. But okay, it sounds like an any day now kinda announcement. Oh well, I just hope they don't drop the ball on this one. I'll use this opportunity to file a bug report the devs may have overlooked. Once the terrain update goes public, that'll be a big deal. The devs know that. That's why they want to deliver a polished package. But here's a glaring problem that needs to be solved. Because once the update is out, the terrain itself will be pretty much in the focus of the people's minds. So it would be a bit awkward when they discover that overpressure explosions do not affect the terrain at all. Doesn't matter if you use a smart canister or a tank. They're still pretty good at damaging structures though. And the mining charges, they work, so that's fine. Though I think there's another bug here. I shouldn't be able to activate this charge when it's still part of a stack. I mean, what is the situation that emerges? Will both of them explode? Crater has the same size, so no. This is just weird. And could we please finally get rid of this long-standing bug that when you grab a Mark I tank by its handles, the rotation of the thing you're holding will be completely different from the rotation that you saw when you grabbed it. Not only is this glaringly off-putting, but it can even mean life or death. That's not something you want to put on the more fragile players who would say this game sucks because I died because there's a bug here. Because this is definitely a bug. The jetpack is now changed. You can no longer fly into space basically, See, the first steps of the new terrain had us not being able to fly at all, and then they solved it by saying, okay, fly as high as you want to, and so we could. And now the jetpack is adjusted for reasonable gameplay. Arguably, the height to which we can fly is a bit low, but then again you're just sitting on some meager gas excretions coming from a magical device that you strap to your back. So personally I like that it's limited now, particularly when you think about very steep mountains. Are we supposed to just ignore them? No, it's good that the terrain matters. Speaking of which, the height to which you can fly depends on the height of the terrain below you. And this doesn't go back to the height map that underlies the generation of the world, but instead it's the actual height of the ground below you. So that means if you dig a deep hole, then indeed your flight ceiling will lower, as you can see here. We're sinking a bit because I made a hole here. They smoothed this out with a spherical check so you wouldn't sink into every last hole, which is probably quite relevant on Vulcan. Yeah, so they're definitely ramping up to handing us something like a finished product. I mean, development will continue, even past version 1.0, which the upcoming terrain update is not. But it's good to always aim for a finished product, because that's the goal after all, and that's also what we'd appreciate to be able to play. Got some more info about the upcoming terrain update. On the 10th of September, the Discord beta changelog was talking about some major update pop-up, so we discussed that, and one of the longtime community members said,
Simon said he was writing the update newsletter, but wanted a few days to do a Vulcan playthrough. I would imagine the update is going to drop any time now.
And we must really be getting close, because we've got this pop-up now on the beta, which you can either okay, so it comes up the next time you start Stationeers, or you can say don't show again. This information is saved in a file called player cookie, which is probably not new, but I've never investigated it. And here you could reset those dialogs by deleting these lines or changing the flag from true to false. Anyway, back to the dialogue. It says, this is the largest update we've ever released for Stationeers. It brings huge changes to the game, including a complete terrain rewrite, a rewritten save load system, significant improvements to multiplayer and overall performance, and stability upgrades. Because of these changes, old saves are not compatible and we will not make them backward compatible. If you like to try converting your saves, the community has created tools that may help. Visit our Discord to get advice and assistance from other players. We know losing saves is frustrating, but this rewrite lays the foundation for the future of Stationeers. Thank you for your understanding, and we can't wait for you to experience what's new. In the previous news video I talked extensively about the new save game system, and there's also a video where I demonstrate one of the conversion tools, and the description of that video has the link to another related tool, so maybe you want to check that out. Anyway, once you've okayed that dialogue, there will probably be another one which told me 496 old saves detected. The save system has been rewritten from scratch and old saves are no longer supported. There are some community tools that you can use to convert old saves. In this case, make sure to back up your save folder before attempting to convert. And now there are two buttons here, delete and ignore, and of course I click the ignore button because I don't want to lose all those save games. And will it really just go and delete a bunch of folders? That's wild. Anyway. And then we're back in the game. So that's what you'll be greeted with. In other words, I suggest that when the update drops, the first thing you do is you back up your saves or you rename the saves folder. Because imagine you click this delete button and then you're like, wait, it's now all gone? And the answer might be yes. Of course you have a data backup of your computer anyway, but still, better safe than sorry. Having to plug in the backup drives is quite heavy-handed. Hey Rocketworks, I think most of us would love if we could have the gas composition of our own environment as a head-up display. I mean, to look into a pipe you'd still need the tablet, but it would even create a greater sense of immersion if we could see how the gas around us slowly changes over time without having to use the tablet. I mean, that would kind of give us a sense of smell, widening the experience squeezed through the narrow channel of audio and video. And thermal vision? Stationeers was made for this, technically. I don't know what the engine would say to this, but Splinter Cell faked actual heat vision 20 years ago. And boy, would we like to see how hot our pipes are. This would even spice up the gameplay, because many people would resort to insulated pipes all the time once they have the resources, but with this heat vision, they would then be blindsided. So there would be yet another decision factor in this wonderfully complex game. By the way, I made these thermal imaging recordings in the basement. I always wanted to be able to see heat in the world around me, since that's such a significant component of the cosmos. I mean, it's fundamental to reality after all. So I eventually got this HIG micro camera. And while we're at it, I was curious enough to also get this Geiger counter. And while it's pretty boring to see it tick away slowly, maybe it's a good thing that I never found an opportunity so far to compare whether it actually steps on the gas when there's a significant radiation source. I always wanted to have this Stationeers awareness in my everyday reality. Well, while we're on the topic of wishful thinking, it's great that we have the tablet holder where we can still see the gas composition of the environment by walking up to the table and zooming in, I guess. But you can't affix the tablet to the wall. I mean, films and TV shows and so many games have been adding all kinds of wall displays for a more science fiction-like feeling. And yeah, they add a lot of flavor to the 3D sci-fi experience, but what they display is usually just fake. Not always, but in most cases. In Stationeers, we have the unique opportunity to plaster the walls with actually relevant information, which many do by spreading out LED displays. Having the tablet affixed to the wall, now that would be something, but maybe that will actually happen, no? Just now, the devs introduced a new computer. First we had the modern one, and then the retro one. Now we have this big one, for the wall. The motherboard is slotted in on the right side. But that's not all. That same new computer is now also available for the floor. So what can these new computers do? Oh, the same thing that the old ones can. So they can't display the Atmos analyzer stuff, for example. But a long while ago, the developers said that they would like to implement Lua in Stationeers to replace all the console user interfaces. And I'm probably misremembering this, but I believe to have heard that we would also get access to this so that we could create our own user interfaces. Meaning that walls full of LEDs could become nice and even interactive screen content. So maybe we'll eventually get our wall-mounted Atmos analyzer. Okay, that was a lot of fantasy here. Fact is, we have these two screens. Loosely announced as Lua. Everything else is hope. If you've ever tried to use one of the wind turbines, by blowing at them, you know they don't react to that. Not too well known and rarely used, though very interesting, are the turbine walls, which do react to standard air movement. I don't know what the reason is that these turbine walls were just removed from the game, and if that's an accident or intentional. But anyway, they're gone now. Maybe the reason is that these could be exploited to create energy out of nothing. Just add enough of them together and blow at them. But I'll sure be missing them. I'd like them to come back, honestly. The world list is now sorted according to difficulty again, so kinda like it has been on the public version for the last 6 months. Except I believe Venus was at the bottom, and I think that's justified because it's the hardest. On beta right now, Vulcan is sorted at the bottom. I assume this is due to alphabetic sorting as the second priority after difficulty sorting. And I have to correct myself. I have been saying a few times that Vulcan cannot have been cracked by the tidal forces of the black hole if it's a supermassive one. Turns out that this is entirely possible though. I was thinking about smaller and more mushy objects like, well, humans. A planet could easily experience gravitational differences between its far and near side large enough to damage the crust. So much for the easily digestible stuff. Now we'll dive into the IC10 MIPS assembly programming topics. Let's start this easy by talking about the standard programming user interface, which also has a small improvement. From right to left, the F button lists all programming statements that you can use. The descriptions shown here would also be shown if you hover the mouse on a statement in the source code. The next button shows all variables, and this is also where the small improvement comes into play. What these variables actually mean to the computer is now shown, because the computer only thinks in numbers. These numbers are now visible here, which was and is, for example, interesting for the colors. The third button lists the slot variables. I don't see any numbers here. I wonder if they have been forgotten or if they would not be meaningful to show here. So this is information that's relevant when you're dealing with slots, like the arc furnace's input slot. Is it occupied? Is there something in there? The fourth button just makes the editor transparent with some blur, and personally I don't like the look of this at all. It feels too pale, too hazy to me. Here's an example of what it could look like instead. That's not in the game, it's just a video trick. Then we have these three buttons that affect the entire editor content. We can clear it, you can copy it to the clipboard, so then you could use an external editor, which sometimes makes a lot of sense when you're restructuring or when your source code has grown so much that you want to spread it to multiple chips. And the paste button, of course, which replaces the entire editor content with what's in your clipboard. You can also copy and paste individual lines, but for that you have to select them with the mouse and use Ctrl-X, Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V. Finally, we get to the library, in which you can store the entire current script in case you need it in another station or in another place of the same world. This is just copied text, it's not a dynamic link that affects the things in which you've pasted the code. You can publish it on Steam, save it to the library, load it from the library, and of course delete what you've stored here. So let's get into it then. I promise you, if you're into IC10 programming, then the rest of this video will be of great interest to you. And what we're starting with is revolutionary, because the developers changed something radical about device addressing. For demonstration purposes, I will be dealing with the first disk slot of this computer. See, it's showing whether a disk is in the slot. And that's not magic, you know how this works. Here I'm using the load batch named slot LBNS approach. I'm asking, is slot 0 occupied? What you can also see here is me using the same approach, load batch named, to find out the reference ID of the device, so the one objective absolute number that refers to this one thing in the world. Alternatively, I could have just said load L from D0, on which I also have this device, the reference ID. The screws have the downside that you only have a limited amount and that if a device isn't there, your code won't run. So if you're taking the risk of using the chip for multiple purposes, for example also station cooling and pressure, then suddenly things will drift out of whack. Or worse even, maybe the chip stops running while it was taking rebalancing measures like cooling down the station. So obviously I want to demonstrate something new about dealing with reference IDs, which is addressing devices by their unique ID. So I used LBNS, load batch named slot, to find out if there's a disk in the slot. Alternatively, you can use LS, load slot, which requires you to use one of the screws, D0, D1, D2 and so forth. Now I also know whether the disk slot is occupied. What didn't work and still doesn't work is LDS. That statement just doesn't exist. It would load direct slot, so we would load slot information from a device by its unique ID number. Doesn't exist, can't be done. So LD exists, but it doesn't help us here, because we need to read about the slot and not about the device itself. Hey, what's that? Why is that crossed out? Well, it's crossed out because it's deprecated. In programming, that means that statement still exists and works, but you're not supposed to use it because at some point in the future it will stop working, and currently there's a better way, which you're encouraged to use instead. And what is that better way? This is the big reveal. You're supposed to use LS. L and S are normally used to address devices on screws, but now they can also be used to address devices via the reference ID, which is, by the way, how the screws internally work also. They use the reference ID. And what does that mean? Well, LS exists. That means now we can load the slot information of a device via its reference ID by using LS instead of the non-existent LDS. See, for demonstration I loaded the reference ID from the D0 screw with L. Could also have used LBN like I did in the row above. Once you have the reference ID, you can now deal with its slot information. You probably know where this is heading, right? Well, we've been having the command BDNS, branch device not set. So if screw D0 is not set to a valid device, for example you haven't screwed yet, or the device was deconstructed, then this statement will branch, because D0 is not set. But since the devs said they added direct referencing into all device index logic circuit instructions, this means that all device branch and select instructions, as well as slot-related instructions LS and SS, which I already showed, now all support direct addressing. If you have a reference ID, you can now check whether that reference ID is valid. And if you remember, we also have the new branch device not valid load and branch device not valid save statements, which allow to find out if a certain logic value is valid for that device. Can it be read? Can it be written? So now you can scan for reference IDs freely, and you can check whether that device has a certain logic value for writing and or for reading. It's now completely open and free, which brings us to our next topic, cable networks. The new feature that has been introduced on beta is that you can now scan those networks for connected devices. It's not yet fully implemented, but here's what it is. The cable network has a stack. In other words, just like the manufacturers and the IC10 chips, it has a block of memory where each slot holds a number, just like a register does. And this cable network memory holds the reference ID, so the objective ID number of the object in the world, for all the devices that are connected. And as you can see here on screen, you can read those out now. If you're trying to read from a memory cell that doesn't exist, that's a bug and your program stops running. So that is to be avoided. For this, the devs announced, and the documentation already states, that there's a stack size value, but this doesn't exist yet. If you try to read that out, that's an error. The feature is at least 2 weeks old, so I waited before recording this part in hopes that they would implement it after a few days, but they didn't. I heard somewhere that they're currently not doing it because they fear it might break something, so I'm unsure about this. Anyway, supposedly this will come. What you can supposedly do for now is let the chip crash and use another chip to restart this one, which is pretty crazy. But anyway, in principle, it's possible now to scan the entire cable network for all connected devices. Now with all that out of the way, what are cable network channels? Well, the simplest and most accurate way to say it is they allow you to hand over a number. So one chip could say, write this number to cable channel 0, another chip could say, read whatever cable channel 0 has to say, and that will then be that number. These values are volatile. For example, if you save and load your game, the entire memory, including all the registers of an IC10, will still be there. And similarly, if you restart an IC10's program, the registers will still have the values that they had before. Cable channel values, however, will not be remembered between game sessions. They're volatile. So that's a big difference from, for example, a memory chip, which would fulfill the same purpose. So how can we actually do this? Well, SDB:0 will write a value towards the cable set that is connected to connector 0. Then we say channel 0, and how many of these exist? 8. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we say what value we want to write. So that's really all it is. You write a number and you can read a number. The value will persist. It's not like it's falling out of reality in the next game tick, but it is highly unstable. Any cable network change or saving and loading will wipe it out. So that's the way you would have to deal with this. SDB:0 channel 0, 1, 2, 3 and load R0 DB0 channel 0. Now we have handed over a value from one chip to the other without having to use an extra memory chip. That is simply what this is. Wow, that was extensive, huh? Well, let's go to something simpler then. We have a new IC10 statement. LERP. LERP. Linear interpolation. What does this do? Well, you give it a bottom value and a top value, and then you tell it where from that range you want to pick a number, and that's the number that you get. So if you put in -100 and -50, and you say give me value 0, you will get -100. And value 1 gives you -50. And value 7000 still gives you -50. And value -1000 still gives you -100. So the ratio that you have to give will be clipped to the range 0 to 1. And the numbers that you will receive are strictly from your start to your end value. That's all this is, and while it's not a game changer, it will certainly make some math easier and simpler and more compact, and therefore more likely to be used in the first place. We've got new MIPS commands again. EXT and INS. EXT extracts some bits from a value and INS inserts some bits into a value. Whereas insert doesn't mean the bits would be placed in a certain location and all bits adjacent to that location will be shifted over. But insert means overwrite, like painting over. That's some kind of classic programming lingo which unfortunately stuck around. Anyway, so the EXT command. Here we're creating a numeric value that represents the text ABCD with the relatively new str command. And then here we're extracting some bits from this value. So EXT into whatever target, for example R0, from whatever source, which is R1, our ABCD value. What's the position in the source value where we want to start? I said 8 bits. In other words, we are skipping the D. We're seeing C, B, and A. But I don't want C, B, and A. I only want C and B. And so I say 16 bits. So starting C, we're taking 16 bits. And so we're seeing B and C. 2 times 8 bits. That was the EXT command. The INS command is unfortunately not yet correctly implemented, and here too I waited about 2 weeks and complained about it a few times, but it wasn't corrected yet, so we're currently living with a buggy version. I mean, it's not buggy, it just doesn't conform to the documentation and doesn't conform to how EXT is structured. The EXT command has target, source, offset, and length. The INS command supposedly would have target, source, offset, and length, which is just the same, right? But the reality is it has target, offset, length, and then the source. So the bit of information that would be in the second place, R1 in our example, is just removed from there and instead put at the very end. That's how you can remember this. And what does it do? Well, here we have the value XXXX and GHIJ. Now I'm using the INS command to override some bits in the original value XXXX. I'm saying the target position shall begin at bit 8. So we're leaving the rightmost X alone and then we're overwriting for 16 bits. 16 bits from where? From R1, which is our source. So we're taking 16 bits from that value, we're taking the last 2 characters, IJ, and we're writing them over our original value starting the 8th bit, so leaving the rightmost X untouched, which gives us XIJX. By the way, as you can see, the text display still has some problems. Between some characters there will not be a visual space, so they're visually merged together. I bet this will be solved at some point, but it's unrelated to these new commands. Well, so that was all I have for you today. Now you have a pretty good perspective of many things that will change once the terrain update comes out, which must really be any day now. Doesn't mean that I've talked about all the things in this and the previous videos. For example, when it comes to rocketry, I certainly skipped a lot of that. But you can read all the details in the news article that is tied to all official Stationeers updates published by Rocketworks. Okay then, see you again next time. Since you're still here, would you mind joining the comments section, because I'm trying to solve a problem. See, Rocket handed out some secret download links for Kitten's Space Agency. You know, Kerbal Space Program 2, except by Rocketworks. And they also gave me one, and since KSA will strictly be donationware, they will not sell that on Steam, the first thing I did was to purchase another copy of Stationeers. On itch, of course, since we've learned that the devs get 90% of the cash there instead of, on average, only 50, because of refunds and fees on Steam. Thing is, I don't need this second key, so maybe you can give me some suggestions of how I could go about handing this to one of you, you know? What could be the solution? Could we make some kind of game out of this, and so forth? Maybe you have an idea. Or not. So that was really all for today. See you again next time.